Good evening, and welcome to Understanding the Roots of Racism Education. At this point, we'd like to introduce United Way of Central Indiana President and CEO, Ann Mertlow.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fifth installment of Understanding the Roots of Racism. Our first four sessions covered the topics of health, housing, food insecurity, and transportation. Tonight, our panel is addressing the topic of systemic racism in education. We're here tonight because United Way is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything we do in our community. In order to take the steps necessary to overcome the systems that grow and perpetuate racial inequity in Central Indiana, we must first understand the roots of the problem. United Way is hard at work to eliminate the barriers that prevent every person in our community from achieving their fullest potential, and racism is one of those barriers. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I want to ensure that each of you heard this morning's announcement that United Way was proud to join the Indy Racial Equity Pledge, the first nonprofit organization in Central Indiana to join this collaboration of corporate and civic organizations committed to advancing racial equity in Indianapolis and neighboring communities. By making this pledge, we are committing to specific actions that address racial disparities in health, prosperity, and education. But pledges without action are just words. I give you my word that United Way will hold ourselves accountable for progress toward these commitments, which include financial investments, community initiatives, advocacy, and much more. And we will communicate our efforts and progress along the way. You can look forward to receiving a full account of our pledge and organization's commitments, which will be included in the resources and wrap-up sent to every attendee alongside a recording of tonight's discussion. I quickly want to thank the thousands of you who have logged on to join us for these discussions over the last 4 months, and specifically for making the commitment to do your part to create a more equitable Central Indiana. And lastly, I too am here to continue learning. So upon the start of the discussion, I'll be disappearing from your screen and watching and learning at home alongside you. And now I'm thrilled to introduce to you the moderator for our discussion this evening. Rena Broadnax serves as the 2Gen Education Investment Director at United Way and brings a wealth of professional and personal experience to tonight's conversation. I continue to be inspired by her passion for building sustainable communities and ensuring our education systems create opportunity for all families. Rena, thank you for leading this discussion. The floor is now yours.
Thanks, Ann, and good evening. As Ann mentioned, I'm Rena Broadnax, the 2Gen Education Investment Director at United Way, and I'm thrilled to be joining you as the moderator of tonight's discussion. This topic is very personal for me in many ways. I've made it a lifetime mission to help communities understand that racism is real and it is a struggle and can have a lifetime effect on our brown and Black children. When you logged in, you may have noticed a few questions on the screen to jumpstart your thoughts on tonight's conversation. It is our hope that upon the conclusion of this panel discussion, you will have a deeper understanding of how we got here, and even more importantly, you'll be inspired and know what next steps you can take to create positive change in the community. It is our hope that you will be able to lean into the discussion with open minds and tender hearts as our panelists share and discuss what they have experienced and learned through their life and their career journeys. Tonight, we'll be looking at both historical and recent events that characterize how racism shows up in education with our panelists. I'm humbled to introduce you to them now. We'll start with Brandon Brown, CEO, the Mind Trust. Next, I will introduce you to Dr. Natasha Flowers, Clinical Associate Professor, IU School of Education at uwci. Next, we have Christine Gardzabel, Vice President of Early Learning Administration with Early Learning Indiana. Next is Dr. Patricia Payne, Director of the Racial Equity Office, Indianapolis Public Schools. And lastly, Dr. Sean Smith, Superintendent of Lawrence Township Metropolitan School District. To get us started, I want to ask a question to set the tone for the discussion. I'll pose this question to a few of our panelists. Question is, in what ways does systematic racism exist in our schools today, excuse me, and what does it actually look like in our buildings? What does it look like? What does it sound like? Dr. Smith, would you like to start us off?
Unmuting. Honored to speak. Thank you for inviting me, United Way. I'm honored to be here tonight with you. What does it look like in our schools? Racism is in every aspect of our society. And quite frankly, it's really no different than inside of our school corporations and all of our school buildings. People bring biases, people bring deep-rooted issues inside of the school building that do and will have an impact on children.
Thank you. Patricia, would you like to share? Oops, I think you're muted, Patricia.
Thank you so much. Systemic racism, wherever we are right now, we're drinking in the smog of systemic racism. So, of course, it's going to be manifested in our classrooms, in the buildings that house our children, and in many different ways, because when you talk about systemic racism, it's not just education, it's everything. It's all of those systems. It's health. That's why you see the disparities going on with this COVID. It's housing, the housing challenges that our families have. It's finance, so it's everything. And in our schools, it's low expectations of our students. It's believing the negative stereotypes and the negative assumptions that are made about way too many of our students and acting upon those. And so that's why I'm just so proud to still be around in the Indianapolis public schools after 50 years, because there's still so much to do. And I know I cannot be here forever. And that's why you have to be sure that you're mentoring other people and bringing them up so they can take on the challenges that I know it seems like it will never end, but I'm going to, if I didn't think it could end, then I wouldn't still be around.
Thank you for sharing that. Christine, I'm really interested in how you would answer that question from an early education and Head Start lens.
So I'm honored to have the privilege of, I oversee 8 early childhood child care centers as well as an early Head Start program. And so I know that we start at the birth, right? We have prenatal, we start working with families from the prenatal all the way to age 5 when we hope that they're well versed and ready to go to kindergarten and get into these awesome opportunities that you set forth. But we know it's the foundation that we build there, that we want to make sure that we know that we have and we represent a variety of diverse learners. And so our mission here at Early Learning in Indiana is to make sure that we do that with having a variety of programs for all of our students and our families, making sure that we're very committed to having a diverse classroom. So we are fortunate to have a very mixed, diverse, we have financially, we have a variety of different payers. We have, ethnic different backgrounds, professional different backgrounds. So I think that's really helpful. But it's also one of the curses of early childhood because we don't have the expertise in the teachers, right? So we're laying the foundation, and I always think of the house, right? So we're laying the foundation, and we have all of the challenges that Ms. Patricia just talked about, helping families regulate, learning the habits that they need to build to get ready for school. And why is it important that your child's at school at a time when they're an infant? Because it's the habits that we're starting there that get them ready to have school success later in kindergarten. And so I think it's really important that all of our teachers know that we have a well-versed workforce so that we're starting to lay those foundations and helping families and reach out to them at the very beginning so that we can lay that groundwork for them. And it's the same thing that everybody has spoke to. It's the, making sure we have teachers that are trained to understand what families are going through, what the needs are, and how we address them. And there is a lot of work to do on a daily basis, but I think we see it in our teachers, we see it in our communities, we see it definitely as a Head Start provider. We have to make sure we do all those things, and people wonder why Head Start is such a comprehensive, right? But if they don't have all the health and they're not healthy and they're not physically healthy, then they're not going to be ready to learn at their best capacity. So it's important that we work with families to overcome all of the systemic barriers in the community and in the education system.
Thank you. I would also like to hear, that's the early education and Head Start lens, but then let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Natasha, do you have some insight as to how that's looking on college campuses?
Well, I would like to speak specifically to the preparation of our future teachers. One of the things that we try to impress upon them, and for some re-emphasize, is that racism is a system of hierarchy where one race is superior to other races. And it's very important for us to see it from that lens, because in that framework, only one way of doing things is the right way. Only one way of being is the good way to do it, the right way to do it. And so we try to facilitate conversations, activities, discussions around the fact that there is privilege for white people that they may or may not acknowledge, they may or may not understand, and that certainly compromises peace and success for our children who are from underrepresented populations, specifically Black and Latino. So we try to impress upon them the idea that it is a hierarchy and that we are assigning value to each community, each person, and everyone doesn't have the same value, unfortunately, within that system.
Thank you. Let's take a step back in history. Some of us may be aware that the racial segregation and declining enrollment that exists in the Indianapolis public schools today can be traced back to a decision that was made 46 years ago to merge Indianapolis with its surrounding suburbs. The celebrated Unified Government, or UNIGOV, law brought together about a dozen communities in Marion County into a single large city in 1970. The idea was to put a bigger, more powerful Indianapolis onto the national map, simplify city services, and grow the city's tax base. Indianapolis was not the only city across the country to merge with surrounding county or counties at that time, but we were the only one to explicitly leave schools out of the deal. So I want to pose a question to Brandon. Brandon, how did UNIGOV impact school systems in Marion County? And are we still seeing the impacts of that today?
Yeah, this is a great question. And, I have a lot of conversations with a lot of colleagues from across the country. And the question always is, why in the world do you all have 11 school districts in one city? And, the short answer is what you just said. So, there were a lot of reasons to do UNIGOV. We have a much larger tax base. We have a much larger population. And in a lot of ways, it put our city on the map. And it did, very likely create some efficiencies with the consolidated government. But the reality and a truism since our country was founded is that white folks who look like me will do everything we can not to attend school with Black children. And, I've heard a lot of arguments around why schools weren't consolidated, and there probably are several arguments, right? But the crux of the matter is that a lot of our surrounding communities who at the time were primarily white, a little bit more affluent, fought tooth and nail so that their white children didn't attend school with Black children. And I think that UNIGOV is one example of many examples for hundreds of years in our country where white folks tend to protect our privilege, and where we send our kids to school is one vivid example of where that plays out. And if you drill down, so yes, we have very segregated school districts, but even within school districts, if you look at how we assign students to schools, many folks on this call have probably heard about redlining and how housing discrimination was was and is a major deal in our society, and the vehicle was redlining. Well, if you think about residential assignment of schools in the modern day, I would argue that we still have educational redlining, because if you were to overlay the redlining maps for housing to our current day zoning kids to schools, you would see almost a one-to-one comparison. So the vestiges of multi-sector systemic racism continue to infect the K-12 education system. And to the point earlier, this is a multi-system challenge, and a lot of those systems work in tandem with each other. And what we're left with is a K-12 education system that still has major tenets of systemic racism that have been true in our country for hundreds of years.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That is definitely some deep insight, and crosses over into some of those conversations we had in some of our previous Roots to Racism sessions in regards to transportation health. So thank you for that, Brandon. Shifting gears just slightly, teachers of color represent about 18% of today's public schools workforce, and it's slightly higher in early education. What impact does the lack of teacher diversity have on students? And I want to start with Patricia with this question. Oops, you want to unmute, Patricia.
So anxious to get into the conversation. I keep forgetting that you can't hear a word I'm saying. Many, many years ago, when I came into the profession, which was around in the 1960s, that was one of the only professions that we were welcomed into. That is not the case anymore. Teachers have many options that are those who might be teachers have many more options now. And they are choosing that. They can go into professions where they can get more pay, more opportunities for advancement, and less challenges. So you really have to want to be a teacher to come into the profession. And to tell you the truth, that's what we want. We want people who really want to be teachers. But when I go to speak to pre-service classes, I rarely see Black and brown faces in those classes. And that's a problem, because children, be they children of color or white, need to see teachers of color standing in front of them. Black and brown children need to see people who look like them, people who look like their mama, to tell you the truth, teaching them. They need to see people in decision-making positions. And so it is so that they can emulate us, you see. So it is critical that we see more teachers of color coming into the profession. It is, it's a crisis, to tell you the truth, because IPS is not the only school district that has almost 80% white teachers. But our student population is just the opposite, you see. And I'm not saying that there aren't white teachers who can't teach children of color, but I am saying that they have a directly different experience than their children. And that's very, very important when you think of it. So that is why we are recruiting all the time to get more and more teachers of color in front of our children and in front of white children. It's important for them to see us in decision-making positions.
Thank you for that. And I full-heartedly agree with everything that you said. Natasha, I'm real interested to hear your take on this question.
She's muted too.
Yep, Natasha, you're muted.
I'm so sorry.
You're
I
good.
certainly agree with everything that Dr. Payne said tonight, just in terms of role models for all children, and just thinking about the effectiveness. in terms of a message of inclusion when you have, again, educators from all cultural backgrounds. I do want to speak to the fact that teachers of color certainly bring to the table experiences around empowerment, as well as experiences with racism and oppression. So they are likely to see racism for what it is. They're likely to know what it feels like when another teacher recognizes that their language, while it may not be what is in the textbook, it is still rich, it is still important. And we need teachers that do that work. And the question of whether or not white teachers can teach children of color, I get this question all the time from my pre-service teachers who have enough reflection to even worry about that, to ask themselves, can I be effective in this educational space that is multilingual and multicultural? And our response and, the research and lived experiences tell us that an effective teacher listens, an effective teacher respects children as capable learners. What happens is that we may have teachers who have not had the opportunity to really think about, as Dr. Smith said earlier, their biases that have negative impact on children. So we want all future teachers to come to us with an open mind, with the understanding that they will learn about cultural differences, but at the end of the day, they're going to learn that they can be complicit in racism, but they can also help to create an inclusive community. And that's what we're hoping for, that we have this population of teachers that come ready to do that kind of intellectual and psychological work. I do want to say that it helps to have partners like Lawrence Township who work with us on a district-based alternative certification program. That's where we get our future teachers of color who have worked in the school system, who have shown themselves to be committed to children in part-time positions in various roles across the district. So we're trying to do our best with all districts to build these partnerships, with Wayne Township as well, and hoping to do the same with IPS and other districts. But we need to think differently so that we can have teachers who want to do the work of equity.
Absolutely. Christine, I want to also pose this question to you from that early education lens, and even though the diversity percentage is slightly higher, how does that impact early education?
So two things come to mind for me is that core to the Head Start belief from the very beginning of the Head Start program over 50 years ago, one of Head Start's strongest recruitment strategies was to recruit and uplift our parents, right? So we've always been very key in saying, let's help the children, the family, and that includes in getting, the parents. And one of my success stories was one of our greatest maintenance men ever, who was started as a dad, Head Start dad, right? And so we use that strategy to uplift our families, to empower our families, to get them working, to get them stable, and have many stories where I've seen parents now, directors, Head Start has a phenomenal alumni of people, and looking at that. And but I also have to switch to that, because what the other piece I think of is that we've built the early childhood workforce on many backs of Black and brown women, mostly women in our field. And yet when you look at the disparity of pay, right, my teachers don't make, is honestly, when I look at the thing, my average teacher makes about our support teachers are making less than $11 an hour, and our teachers, some of them with bachelor's degrees, are making on average $12 to $14 an hour. So the pay disparity in early childhood, when we know that we do have more Black and brown women of color working in our early childhood programs, and we're setting their families up to be unsuccessful. And I know so many, I say it all the time, so many of my early Head Start teachers, and even in my childcare program, my childcare teachers, they're standing in the same lines for subsidy, for resources, because they're still with families, they're still living at or that poverty, or we're paying them just a little bit so that they don't get those extra benefits. And then their families are suffering, and they're committed to the work, and they're committed to being in those classrooms every day. And so I really have to make sure that that's set, right? That the disparity for our teachers of color that are here is really a different, we look at it from a different lens because of that pay disparity. It's much different if you're working in the K-12 system.
Good point. And that kind of takes me back to the comment that Patricia made earlier about, if you're stepping into the teaching profession today, you really have to want to teach. So absolutely, that confirms that. Christine, thank you. So next question. Poor children and children of color are not only less likely to be identified as gifted and talented, but more likely to be identified as requiring special education services. What is the school district's role in monitoring the numbers? How are districts being held accountable as the number of special education classrooms continue to grow? Dr. Smith, I'd like to start with you on that one.
Well, I think at my level, much has changed through the years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have to remind you, I'm a former teacher, classroom teacher. Pat Payne, I was influenced by several in the Indianapolis public schools to become a teacher. And so I get it at all levels. I've actually 32 years have been at every level. This issue has been around for years because it's real simple. It's easy to, this kid is misbehaving, he's not performing well, so there's something wrong. Put a label or tag on that student. In particular for African-American males is even at a higher rate. So school corporations have now had the state of Indiana come in and regulate and count our numbers to make sure that we are not discriminating. But I say to people, why isn't it a moral issue for those that are teaching to say to themselves, this is wrong? As a classroom teacher, if a kid had misbehaviors, I didn't immediately think that this child had a special need. Why did they need a label? There could be something wrong, or that they needed additional support. So we have systems that are in place, even amongst our school boards, and of course I said the state of Indiana, but even with our leaders that are leading schools today, because what they're finding is that we've mislabeled kids, and in particular kids of color. That all kids of color are special education, not identified for high ability. Years ago, I taught high ability. I'll give you guys a story later if you want about people's perception about who should be teaching high ability in our schools. But I say to you, and that's the opposite effect, that kids of color can't get to that level because they don't qualify. So Dr. Payne, I'll let you talk because we can stay on this topic all night, because that's the root of the problems when we talk about African Americans being able to ascend to higher levels, because they just never get that opportunity. We have created low expectations for them.
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely true. And Dr. Payne, I am definitely coming to you next, but I have to share, my son is 23 now, but when he was in 8th grade and they started to have those conversations, we were in a different state at that time, but they start to have those conversations with 8th and 9th graders about, career and college aspirations. I can recall sitting at the desk with his counselor, and Blake said he wanted to go to college. And the counselor said, to his face,
know what you gonna say.
Can you even spell college? So, that was probably our first moment of seeing racism inside a school district. I definitely want to hear your perspective on this question.
See, the thing that gets me is wherever Black and brown children are in this country, anywhere you go, the same thing is happening. So that ought to send the message, but it doesn't. Instead of looking for the brilliance that our children bring with them to the classroom, as Dr. Lisa Delpit says in her book, Other People's Children. I love that book. Instead of looking for the brilliance that they bring and infusing their experience into our instructional strategies, no, we're looking instead for the wrong. And one of the things that I always tell teachers is that students will bend to meet your low expectations, just like they will rise to meet your high expectations. The students that some teachers have sitting in the back of the room and never calling on, and who finally withdraw from the whole process, are probably some of the most brilliant students that are seated in that classroom, but they never get a chance to show that brilliance, you see. And maybe I'll bring this analogy up now. I'm not sure if it fits, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, because it deals not only with Black children, but Black people in general. And it's the Monopoly game. Now, when I was coming through, everybody got $200. I hear it's $1,500. Now, it doesn't matter. Everybody gets the same amount of money when you start. But if you start 3 hours behind everybody else, when you finally get into the game, everything is gone. All the hotels, everything is gone. So you feel relieved when you land in jail. And I think that's what Black and brown children feel. You know, that's when they just, their hands up, you know, they never get called on. Some teachers, thank God, not most teachers. It's almost like some teachers feel intimidated by the brilliance of Black and brown children. And that's because it goes against what's in their belief system. Those belief systems are very, very powerful. And so that's one of the ways you've got to start. If you're going to treat children like they should be treated, and like you said, Dr. Smith, it should be a moral issue. How can you do this? These are human beings. These are babies. And even when children haven't even left the womb yet, they are exposed to racism because of the lack of prenatal care that their mother gets based on what? One criteria only: Black skin. Mm-hmm. So something is very, very, very wrong here. And we have got to correct this. We have got to correct this. It's got to be a moral issue.
I definitely agree. And she, as she takes a deep breath, Pat, those words are powerful. I will share with the audience that my son did go on to college and he graduated with honors.
Of course.
Yeah,
of course.
Absolutely. So, you know, speaking, let's shift gears a little bit. Brown and Black boys are sent to the office, suspended, expelled at much higher rates than their white peers. They are often referred to as angry, disruptive in class, and aggressive. Data shows Black children are also more likely to experience preschool suspensions. Many states are now examining the issue and developing preventative measures and policies to prevent such occurrences. What can and is being done across educational settings to begin to address this issue of the racial discipline gap? Christine, I'm going to start with you since you work with those littlest ones.
Yeah, and when you looked at the I believe it was Yale that put out that study just a few years ago, about 2016, 47% so of all of the expulsions were happening at the preschool age, right? And again, I'm here to say, you know, I know my brain science, the neuroscience, right? We're building the foundation so they can be ready so they can go to kindergarten and beyond. And it's heartening. It is. It's very heartbreaking to know that we were expelling or putting out 47% of our preschool. Most of them are boys of color. Most of them boys and most of them of color. And so what are the things that has changed? So for our Head Start programs, because that was one area, the National Head Start program performance changed that area. So Head Start programs are not allowed to use expulsion as a discipline or a thing. You now have to have every Head Start program across the country now has to have a system of, like, before you can expel them, you have done everything to work with that family, to bring in mental health consultants. And I think the beginning of it, and that would be in childcare too, is to make sure that you're training, right? Behavior, and I love what Dr. Payne said, because behavior is a form of communication. That's what I consistently tell my teachers and our staff, right? Communication, what are they saying to us? Even our small infants and our toddlers, it's Behavior is a form of communication, and what are they saying to us? What are they, what are the gaps that we're not missing? There's a story behind every behavior, and we need to make sure we're looking at that and helping all of our teachers understand what does that mean, and how do we look at that? Looking at making sure in my program over the last, and I've been in Head Start for well over that I probably want to admit, but and as administrator coming from some of the largest programs in the state of Indiana, and realizing where I started and what's now happening in the last 3 to 4 years with before the pandemic, with the opioid. I mean, my mental health budget has tripled just because of the experiences that we have. Indiana has the highest infant mortality rate. So when I'm looking at, our very prenatals and our young infants, we have some of the highest DCS and foster care rates. So how am I helping support my teachers when we leave? One day our children are here, the next day DCS comes out and takes them away. I mean, that's a whole nother system that we're trying to build. And those are the kids that we want to be able to track more, because we're already setting them up to know that they already have these. When they get to kindergarten and they're doing the behaviors, who's there watching them to making sure that these behaviors are rooted in something that has happened in their past or that's happened. And we need to understand that communication, that problem, that behavior is a form of communication. And it's not just, I don't understand how you could be fearful of a 5-year-old, right? Majority of you you could take them, you really can't. So I don't understand that, but it's really about, I think somebody said it here earlier, about those beliefs and those values. If you just, all you look at is the color of his skin, you're never going to give him a chance, and you're not going to be the one to connect with him and give him the hug that more than anything that he needs is just that hug, and to know that someday today he's safe, he's going to get fed, and he's going to be loved in that school. And if we don't start them off in that way, the boys that are expelled, and we look at that track, we set them up, that birth to prison pipeline is real, because they get pushed out from the beginning of the kindergarten, from early childhood, then they go into the school systems, and those same systems are in place, and they're pushed out from kindergarten, and they may or may not even make it to secondary ed. And how do they do that? And we set them up for all the research shows health disparities and all the things, unemployment for the rest of their life, and it starts in early childhood. So it's very important to the work that we're laying and the foundation that we're putting in place in our programs.
Very well said, Christine. I wholeheartedly agree. Patricia, I can tell you have something to say on this subject. Oops, you're muted.
Then I was trying to unmute some. Give me the question again. I
Yeah.
want to hear it again.
Yeah, so Black and brown boys are sent to the office, suspended and expelled at much higher rates than their white peers. They often referred to as angry, disruptive, and aggressive. So, what do you see?
The same thing we see all the time, everywhere we go, where Black and brown young men are. And it is so disturbing to go into a special education Black classroom and see nothing but African-American males seated there, usually doing nothing or drawing. And then you go into a high ability classroom and you see exactly the opposite. And all that ever goes through my mind is the brilliance that is being wasted sitting there. And the other thing is, when teachers are really finding the brilliance in these children and all that they can bring to the table, all it does is make their job easier. It really, really does. Because children, if you are serious about who they are and where they come from, they will do what is needed to achieve in that classroom. I mean, I've seen it too many times. I see Dr. Smith's hand up. So you see it all the time. And when you go into the high ability classroom, I could take some of the same young people seated in the those classrooms where most of the children are Black males and put them in that high ability classroom, and they will rise to whatever the need is. If they are treated with respect and they are treated with from teachers who know that they can achieve, they will do it. I've seen it too many times. I taught second grade for 25 years. I wouldn't let them put me anywhere else. 25 years. And I saw it going on. And I would use their experience and infuse it in my instructional strategies. I prepared them for all those daggone standardized tests by using their, you know, if it was something dealing with whatever, I would take something from their experience to show them the skills that they needed to pass those tests. Oh boy, I miss the classroom a lot.
Well, Patricia, we're so glad that you're still around, you know, sharing your knowledge and experience. Dr. Smith, would you like to comment on this as well?
Yes, I want to flip it the other way, because I think when we think of classrooms, we have to be careful. I'm going to give my experience as an African American teacher. I was hired into a neighboring district after I left IPS, Pat, and I was a high ability teacher. I was asked by the principal to be a high ability teacher.
Okay.
And at that time, guys, I'm going back over 25, almost 30 years ago. And I had a class of predominantly white students. So you know where I'm going, folks. About the second week of class, the parents began to hear about their new teacher, Mr. Smith. And I had in the back of my classroom 10 white moms wanting to watch me teach their white students. Okay. We can't talk about racism unless we talk about the real stories of what's going on in our society, because the perception was that this young man from inner city Indianapolis, I graduated from their state university, I graduated from IU Bloomington, was he up to snuff to teach these students? Well, the rest was history. I did very well, folks. And many of those students I still know to this day. I've actually hired a couple of them. They actually work in my school district, very bright young people. But we have to understand what racism is all about, how deeply rooted it is in our society, that our perceptions and our biases, what it does to a school. So that in particular school district just decided, you know, we're going to break down the barriers. We want an African-American male teaching, and did it almost 30 years ago. But today in our schools, there are many schools today that don't allow African-Americans to teach the highest levels. And we need to just be open about that. And I think that sends a negative message and the wrong message to all of our students who should experience the brilliance of all people of all races.
Absolutely. So now we really are going to shift gears and
Tina,
go deeper.
Can I just say one thing?
Oh, absolutely, Patricia.
And it goes to what it deals with Dr. Smith. I remember when Dr. Nate Jones, everywhere you would see him, he would, like if he went to a conference, if it was out of state, it didn't matter. He always had these young men with him. Sean was one of them. They were always dressed in suits, looked so professional. He was mentoring them to move to higher levels. And Sean, please forgive me for calling him Sean. I just been knowing him since he was so little. Sean, you do the same thing. You are mentoring young men so they can see your experiences and grow from that. So see, that's an example of what we have to do.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll shut up.
If you, you know, if you're listening today, I encourage you to go to the Lawrence Township website and see who is leading schools in Lawrence Township.
Yes.
School leaders in Lawrence Township reflect the racial background of students who attend Lawrence Township. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because Superintendent Smith has been incredibly intentional around mentoring, around developing clear and intentional leadership pipelines. And that matters. So we have a school district in our county where in third grade, if you're white, you're 8 times more likely to be identified as high ability than if you're Black.
Right.
So if we all believe that brilliance is equally distributed, clearly opportunity is not, because the outcomes that we're talking about, regardless of what assessment or measure you use, are a direct result of a lot of the implicit and explicit racial biases that we have in our education system. And as we mentioned earlier, teachers from all races can learn how to be great teachers. The reality is, though, that research says white teachers hold lower expectations for Black and brown students. That's a fact. So as white educators, we got to do the work in ourselves to make sure that we're not unintentionally lowering expectations for Black and brown students, and we're holding them to, really high expectations and high levels of performance, which is why the last 2 questions in my mind are really the same question, right? So the disparities that we see with school discipline are one of the inputs that lead to the disparities in academic outcomes. And we have to be honest about why that is. And, to just be really honest, as a white guy, white educators have to look into ourselves and really start to interrogate our own biases. And it's hard, right? It's painful sometimes.
Of course it is.
But we got to do that hard work because we owe it to the kids that we're serving.
And Brandon, this then impacts the economy, the future opportunities for people of color. And then we ask why we have so many African Americans that are poor and lack of opportunities, is that they never receive the opportunity to sit in advanced level classes that lead to higher paying jobs. And you're playing the catch up game. And so we just need to break down the barrier. I just have this vision. I've told people, teaching all types of students, and I tell you that the kid is going to figure out a cure to cancer. It's not sitting in suburban. It's going to be this kid sitting in a poor inner city somewhere waiting to explode. So if we take all youngsters and value them and give them a sense of purpose, folks, we're going to be able to solve a lot of the issues that are in our society. And right now, folks, we need a lot of help. We need a lot of help.
Exactly.
I'll take a deep breath on that one. I totally agree, Dr. Smith. Let's talk about school funding. So how does Indiana fund schools using the complexity index to ensure districts who need the most support are receiving those resources that they need? Are we doing enough? If not, what else can be done to bring equity into funding the classrooms? And Brandon, I'm going to let Dr. Smith catch his breath, and I'm going to pivot and let you start on this one.
Sounds great. So I promised our team that I wouldn't get too wonky on this because school funding in Indiana is really complex. But, so if we start at a high level, the reality is that in Indiana, like most states, we fund schools using local property taxes and state level revenue. And I just wanted to kind of sit in the fact for a second that it's 2020 and we still fund schools using property taxes, which means that the relative wealth of a community directly dictates how much funding schools receive. Another just blatant example of systemic racism. So when it comes to the complexity index, the state, to its credit, has acknowledged that it takes more resources to effectively serve kids from marginalized communities. And I think it's also acknowledged that there are major local wealth gaps where it's important for the state to come in, and to try to equalize those gaps. So the complexity index, just, really briefly, is a formula that the state uses to take into account the characteristics of children who attend schools and school districts. And then that is used in the calculation to determine how much per pupil funding schools get. So in general, schools that serve more low-income students, more children with special needs, will receive a little bit more money from the state. But what's happened, if we're being really honest with ourselves, is the past 6 to 8 years, the complexity index and the weight that the complexity index has in the overall state formula has been on the decline. So changes that have happened now in multiple legislative sessions have reduced the impact of the complexity index. And that's in large part because wealthy suburban districts have effectively lobbied the state to get more money. And we know that the pot isn't growing quickly enough in order to meet the full need. So what happens? It's a zero-sum game. And to be honest, wealthier, primarily white school districts are the ones that are gaining. Low income, primarily Black and Latino school districts are the ones that are losing. And those changes matter, and they matter honestly to schools of all types, right? They matter to charter schools, they matter to neighborhood schools, and we sometimes get wrapped up in the school type conversation, and the reality is that there's actually a lot of shared interests among schools who are serving very marginalized students, and the complexity index, in my mind, is just one clear example of, again, structural racism in the way that we fund schools directly harming Black and brown students while it's helping white, more affluent students. Just one more point. So there was recently a study on school funding in our state that proved the more white students a school serves, the more money that school receives when taking into account property taxes and money from the state. Once again, the more white students a school serves, the more money that school receives. Another vivid example of systemic racism and how we resource schools. One more fact from that study, and this one might be controversial and we might not have complete agreement here in the panel. If you're a Black or brown student that attends a charter school in Indianapolis, you receive over $7,000 less than your traditional public school peer. And that's primarily driven because charter schools don't receive any local property taxes. And in Indianapolis, the reality is that more Black and Latino students attend charter schools in IPS than they do traditional public schools. And in my view, if we care about true equity for Black and Latino students, that should be alarming. And again, it's another vivid example of how systemically racist the system is that we use to resource our kids.
Yeah, I'm glad that you tied it to that, Brandon, because that, in my opinion, that is definitely, a clear example of systemic racism. And Dr. Smith, I definitely want to give you the opportunity to work.
Well, I live it as a school superintendent. Very respectful of our state legislature and our governor, the work that they do to try to provide the resources to us. But I think Brandon hit it right on the tail, is that all is not equal. But at the same time, we have youngsters who of color tend to have more needs because of issues of poverty, youngsters that don't speak English, and all the programs that we need to help those youngsters get up to a higher level. It costs more money. And then we have this complexity index, and then we have school funding that's really not simple, and it just leads for a complete disaster throughout the state of Indiana. We have some rural districts who should be at the table with us also, because they're not receiving enough money to fund their schools. The simple thing, public, that you need to understand is that the state of Indiana truly tries to fund all students equally in the state of Indiana. The problem is that behind the scenes, a school corporation, including mine, can step out and pass a school referendum and get additional dollars that other districts can't. It's a historic thing happened a couple weeks ago. Gary, Indiana was able to pass a school referendum after all that they've been through. And most communities that are poor don't have a chance to pass a referendum to gain additional dollars for their schools. So there's the dilemma. We talk about teacher salaries, we talk about programming. The poor schools are not going to attract the best teachers because they don't have the salaries and benefits. And here we are on this endless cycle of the poor kids getting the worst situation. Brandon talks about charter schools and their dilemma because of the way they're set up in the state of Indiana, Brandon, which is different than other states, because in many other states, the charter schools are underneath the local umbrella of the local school districts and could benefit from those taxes. But Indiana set them up to be more in competition with the local schools. So maybe that needs to be fixed. There are a lot of things with school funding that we've got to fix quickly, because if we're talking about bringing an end to systemic racism and poverty, we're going to need resources for these students. And we have to have funds to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Smith. So pivoting just slightly, racial socialization is present in all level of educational systems, but is certainly a discovery point for many students of color as they step into college campuses. Sad but true, many receive the message that they don't belong. In response, it's common for the students to seek support systems, advice from Brown and Black counselors and advisors, and sometimes they search for that safety net that I think most Brown and Black people know is referred to as that Brown and Black bubble. What advice do you have? And I'm going to pose this question to Natasha. Natasha, what advice do you have for our minority college students as they start with their campus experience?
Oh, gosh. Well, I do want to say before I answer the question, I do wish we had more time to talk about the structure in terms of public schools, traditional public schools, and charter schools,
And charter
especially around the competition, especially around how historical racism impacts the choices that parents have and do not have around quality schools, the difference between adequate training and professional development. I wish we could talk about all of that.
Me too.
And I appreciate that Brandon put it on the table, but I know that this is not, you know, a discussion solely about charter, but I do think it impacts Black and Brown communities so much that when we bring it up, it's so hard to pull out of the conversation. But there's always another webinar, Brandon, and I hope I get a chance to
let us hope so.
engage you in a different way. But to get back to Rena's question that she posed, or just asking about advice, I have 3 sons. One is a junior at Morehouse College. One is a senior at Ben Davis High School. And I have a 15-year-old who is just, you know, trying to keep his head in the game and just trying to stay alert and do the work that needs to be done so that he is not in trouble with his parents. But so I feel very strongly about a system in place at the college level where our children, the minute they step foot on campus, they know that they are welcomed. I'm not an expert on, you know, student affairs, and I respect folks who study the best practices and fight for an inclusive climate. I do want to say that just as a Black faculty member and a Black parent, I feel strongly that our children have to quickly identify those in financial aid, that advisor, the person in admissions who will answer their questions comprehensively and with respect. If you are being moved to and transferred to 3 or 4 different people, tell the person in charge. You know, don't go fussing to your friends about how awful the system is. Go directly to the person who has director in their title and say, I can't get my questions answered. It is very important for our youth to do that. Now, there are a lot of 18, 19-year-olds that go to college or older adults who know to ask those questions, but sometimes you don't want to look like a jerk. Sometimes you don't want to appear to not know what you don't know. But I'm speaking to every parent out there. Keep telling your children to ask questions. There is no dumb question. There's no such thing as a stupid question when your future is at stake. I will say that it's very important for our Black and Brown students, our Black and Latino students especially, to attend orientation. You know, you get to a certain point in life where you think, oh, I don't have to do that. I can read what's on the website. But to me, orientation will at least showcase the people who are paid to do the work of making sure that you have everything you need. So go to the orientation, read every single email that you get from your advisors. That's very important. But if I had to close, it would be to report discrimination. Always report it. If there is that one advisor and they're always talking to you like, why are you in our program? You don't belong here. You should be somewhere else. Tell somebody, tell a faculty member, tell the president of your sorority or your fraternity, tell somebody. That person shouldn't be working there. If you can't go in and get a question answered, or you feel like you have to prove your credibility as a college student, something's wrong with them, not you. And I know a lot of students who had, achieved honor roll in high school and get to college and can't find one mentor, can't find one person on the campus that will do the work of making sure that they get to the finish line. And that's a shame. So we have to tell on people who aren't doing their work. Students can do it. I certainly tell on colleagues. If I see that they're not doing their work, and I ask people to check me if I'm not answering email from students, we have to do better. So I just tell parents, just hang in there and keep asking your children, who are you talking to? Who are you asking when you need something? And just continue to support their pushing forward, because all of our children deserve a quality higher education.
Yeah. And might I just say that kind of that should start even before they get to
Absolutely.
the university. It should start. We have a wonderful program, Flora Jones, that has our post-secondary, and she mentors these young people on what to do when you get to the college. And Natasha, might I just also agree with what you said? We need a whole forum on charter schools and traditional public schools. I love you, Brandon, but that's the truth. Ever since you mentioned the word, I can't hardly sit in my seat. But
I know we're rocking.
I know that's the right reason I'm rocking here. But that's very true. It should start even before they get to the, because they can run into some situations that are very strange and out of the ordinary to them when they get on that campus. So everything you said, I agree with, but I'm telling you, I think IPS is doing a great job now of trying to prepare students even before. And it's no one thing. You got to be doing,
yes,
when it comes to this systemic racism, you got to be doing a lot of things at the same time. We have wonderful 2-day 9 to 5 racial equity training. But I don't care how powerful that training is. 2 or 3 days afterwards, this racism is still coming at you. That cognitive dissonance is still working on your belief system. So it's fighting all this new information that you're trying to put into it. And it's true, it's a hard thing to examine your belief system and your mindset. But that's the kind of things that have to happen. So in addition to the training, we're doing so many things in IPS that have never been done before. And that's because, of course, of the leadership. The leadership is so important. Our superintendent is doing an amazing job. Our board is doing an amazing job. But you're doing like principals meetings. We're doing all kinds of things with principals we've never done, because we've got to make them feel comfortable having conversations about race and racism in their schools. So every school has a school equity team so that they can hold this work together within the schools. We got study groups going. We've got community people who are going through our training with us, because that systemic racism doesn't just run through education, as we've said. It runs through health, it runs through housing. It's an equal opportunity employer. But not only does it run through everything, it shapes the outcomes of everything. See, everything is connected. Poverty is a tentacle of systemic racism. It's all connected. Oh, Lord have mercy. It's so much. It's so much.
I just want to quickly, I know, I hear you. I just want to quickly say that Flora Jones worked in Wayne Township and she was amazing with us. And I have to give a shout out to Janika Jones and Sherman Woodard, who work within our student services, Black female, Black male, just two powerful people that have our students' backs. But we have to name them. We have to name them.
You're right.
And give them credit, because they don't often get the credit of doing all the work, engaging parents constantly,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
And they're with our sons and daughters from,
Mhm.
early on to make sure they get to the finish line. So
Yeah. Taking
yes,
them on these trips to the
absolutely.
university so they know
Yes,
what to expect. That's right.
absolutely.
Laura Jones doing her thing.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, beautiful, and that you can share those personal examples from all your experience. That's why we have you all on the panel tonight. I want to quickly, I'm watching the clock here. I wanted to make sure we get this question in, and I'll pose it to maybe one or two of you. And Pat did a good transition. She mentioned school boards. So nearly every school board across the country is challenged, right, faced with systematic racism and diversity issues at some level or capacity. What advice, and I'm going to point to you, Brandon, I'd be really interested to see what you say. What advice do you have for school boards working to address the diversity and inclusion?
Yeah. So first, I think we've got another part of the series because we have a conversation about charter schools clearly that
I make note.
folks want to engage in.
Why did you say that again?
So I have sat through a lot of long school board meetings over the years, right? 2-hour, 3-hour meetings. And I tend to find a lot of the conversation focused on real estate and a lot of focus on, a lot of the operational components of running schools. All that's really important, and clearly a school board should have the fiduciary oversight to ensure that a school district is running well operationally. But I hear very little conversation about student achievement. And it's my view that the role of a school board member is an elected official that has been entrusted by the citizens to ensure that public schooling is accomplishing the goal of schooling, right? So we can have a conversation around the right metrics, and the right outcomes, but I, at least in the school board meetings that I listen to, hear very little conversation about student achievement, which seems to me to be the central function of a school district. And I think that the corollary to that is I hear very little conversation about the academic disparities when it comes to Black and Latino students. When you hear about student achievement, oftentimes you hear the aggregate numbers, which can mask major racial disparities. And then they unintentionally, maybe, or intentionally, get swept under the rug. And who loses? Marginalized students lose because we're not even willing to name the thing. And I would just challenge, school board members across the city, maybe aspiring school board members to keep student achievement central. And if you're going to have a racial equity policy, to the point that was made earlier really well, it doesn't matter, and it's really not worth more than the piece of paper that it's written on if you're not going to try to implement that policy. And the board's role is to hold the administration and the team accountable to implementing their high-level policies. And in my view, that should be centered around student achievement, in particular for marginalized students.
Thank you, Brandon.
Wow.
Pat, is that?
I want to say one thing. We've got a board that on June the 20th unanimously passed really a historic racial equity policy. And no, wait a minute. It's a racial equity policy 1619 and a Black Lives Matter resolution. And I'm telling you, I've seen many policies in my day, but they are holding us accountable for making sure that these words are lifted off the page and put into action. And I'm telling you, this Black Lives Matter resolution has things in it that even shocked me, because it's saying, first of all, it's apologizing for what IPS has done to further systemic racism with the SEG, our integration, all of that is in this policy. So I've just got to give our school board a lot of praise for doing what should have been done a very long time ago. And because of that, we have gone from a moment to a movement. And that's what IPS is about now.
That's a beautiful thing. Christine, would you like to weigh in on this? I know, with you working in the field of early education and, the children that you work with are going on to elementary and high school. What advice would you have for school boards?
I think that one of the things, again, Head Start we don't have a school board, but we do have the policy council that's embedded into our policies that we actually say parents have to have just enough of a voice. So I start there, right? I ensure that I empower our parents from the beginning and telling them that this is like our version of the school board, to get involved, to be involved, and to make sure we nurture those families as they come into the door, and so that they are getting involved. From the best thing you can have is a strong parent advocate to tell your story, right? So I think that we start there, and then to tell the school boards that we do need more cooperation, right? We're handing children off to kindergarten, and I think if we can build better transitions, and we've talked about that, but like Dr. Payne said, if we can actually do the things that we talk about and having transitions, so that the kids that I'm sending off to all the 11 different school districts, that I get them all, including Hamilton and other surrounding counties, right? I send my students all over the city of Indianapolis. And if I had agreements where I think of like the diversity training that Dr. Payne is talking about, like, why shouldn't my teachers be a part of that? The big core of what we're doing. So how could the school board recognize early childhood providers as the beginning steps of the education system, and make sure that we're partnering, making sure that they're holding their teachers and their principals accountable, those early ed principals? Are they meeting with their early childhood providers? Are they having those conversations? We're getting ready to do a kindergarten fair. I ask all school providers, and it's very rare, and I mean, obviously this year is completely different, but I very rarely get representation from the schools. Charter schools come through. I can guarantee you, Dr. Payne, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I probably had 14 vendors, schools representing in our kindergarten fair, and the majority of them were not very many of them were the public schools. Like they have a niche. They already know that
the charter schools are taking on. Go ahead.
So I invite everybody, but I think it's that communication, right? It starts there. We are preparing your students, and I think the school board having some accountability in that, to understand that there is the number is high. Over 64% of all students come to early childhood before getting into kindergarten. And so to have a school board understand the importance of early childhood and why those relationships with their school systems is so important, I think that would be the biggest piece, I would say, in front of a school board.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you mentioned about lifting that family and that parent and caregiver voice. That is so, so important. Wow, it's been a very impactful time, and I personally could go on talking on this subject and sitting here being engaged with all of you for another hour or so at minimum. But it is almost 6:15, and we must wind down our time with you tonight. So as we close out our time with all of you this evening, it's our hope that each of you leave with a greater understanding than you joined us with at the beginning of the session. It's clear that systematic racism has existed for more than 50 years, and it's still present today. The fight against racism is bigger than any one of us, but all of us have the power and the ability to be the catalyst for change. And we all, from what I've heard you say, we want that change to take place. We all have a role to play. Each one of us can make a difference. Each panelist tonight has answered some very tough questions. It was very engaging, as I said, over the past hour. As we say goodnight, or before we say goodnight, there's a couple things that I want to mention. So first of all, definitely from the bottom of my heart, myself and United Way would definitely want to thank all of our panelists for your time, your energy, your passion. It's important to us. We want to thank the audience for joining us tonight. It's for our very important conversation. And I know many of you have joined for our previous sessions, and we will have another one in December. So please know that you'll receive an email, each of you, with additional resources, as well as a link to register for the next presentation. Mark your calendars. It will be on December 16th, where we will discuss financial success as it relates to racism. I want to leave all of you with just 2 questions to ponder as we close out. What role will you play, and what is your next step in the fight against systematic racism? We thank you for tuning in tonight. Bless you all, and keep doing the great work that you're doing. And those of you that joined us, please stay engaged. Thank you.